Well, ladies and gentlemen, all of our attendees, it's been a riveting discussion since morning, and it's quite endearing to see how everyone is looking towards the word sustainability with different actions for that matter, or different initiatives that they've all taken. But there's one common goal that we're all planning to address. On that note, let's also move forward towards our next special address. This has got to do with gender equal sustainable development. And joining us this evening, we have with us someone who is the Assistant Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General of UN, and at the same time, UN's Women's Deputy Executive Director for Resource Management, UN System Coordination, Sustainability, as well as Partnerships. And she's someone who's always been at the forefront of taking this conversation forward. In fact, we've always heard from her, we've always listened to those videos, and every time we've seen that while she's had a distinguished career at the World Bank Group, serving in various senior leadership and management positions, she's also spearheading these important conversations, and it's only befitting that we have with us her presence here this evening to share with us the special address. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have with us none other than Anita Bhatia, and with that, let's deep dive into this another very, very pertinent session starting in just a few seconds.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to join you today at the Economic Times Summit. And I want to start by just again congratulating the Economic Times for always convening the most timely and pertinent conversations to address the relevant issues of the day. I know that you've been having really rich conversations today about COVID-19, about how to leverage ESG for greater development impact and for achieving the SDGs. And as we just heard from Dia Mirza, there really is a red line today that we need to be discussing and that we need to be thinking about addressing. And I'm going to address this issue from the perspective of gender equality. And let me start by just giving us all a quick reminder of the impacts of the pandemic on women, and just underscore that the pandemic, we all know, had terribly negative impacts on women, but let's just remind ourselves what those were. And there were three. First, on income. Women's income really suffered during the pandemic, not just because many of the sectors in which women were working were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in terms of jobs like tourism, retail, hospitality, but also because of the poverty impacts of the pandemic. And we expect 43 million more women worldwide to fall into poverty in the coming year as a result of the pandemic. The second big impact has been on women's health. Because governments pivoted their public health systems to focus on treating COVID-19, and appropriately so, several services that are really important for women's health, including access to maternal healthcare services and other gynecological and reproductive health services, really suffered in many countries. So women's health has really suffered as a result of the pandemic. And finally, women's security. We saw worldwide that there was a huge spike in violence against women during the pandemic. In some countries, we know from our offices of UN Women on the ground that there was as much as a 500% increase in violence against women. So these three impacts, income, health, and security, were very visible during the pandemic, but also will have long-lasting implications. Now, when we think about the role of ESG and gender equality and connected to these impacts, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that an ESG lens can do that not having an ESG lens would enable? So having an ESG lens is absolutely vital as we think about building back better. And why do we say this? Because we have looked, UN Women, along with UNDP, at most of the policy measures that have been undertaken by governments in response to the pandemic. And we've also looked at what the private sector is doing and what business is doing to respond to the pandemic. And this is what we found. Of most of the policy measures that have been undertaken by governments, less than 13% of these fiscal stimulus packages that have been rolled out across the world have been able to target women. A, because targeting is hard, but also because gender lens is not something that is front and center for policymakers. And it is essential that as we think about environmental, social, and governance, we think about a gender lens in each of these. And let me talk in particular about the social aspects of the SDGs and about gender-based financing, because what is going to be essential to build back better is actually increasing the levels of investment, both public as well as private, in pushing the agenda on gender equality. Now, how can we do this? There are many different ways of doing this. First of all, we are recommending that as governments undertake new phases of fiscal stimulus packages, that they do so with a gender lens. That means following the example that we saw in India, for example, where cash transfers were made available to 200 million women during the pandemic, we're asking governments worldwide to think about issues like that and to see how they can get money directly into the hands of women. Second, we are asking that they think about how to create support services for women-owned businesses so that they can get back on their feet. We are asking them also to consider the impact of the care burden that women carry. Even before the pandemic, we know that women were doing 3 times as much unpaid care work as men. Now, if we think about what that is doing to women, what it is doing is reducing female labor force participation, because as a result of this care burden and having to deal with work at home as well as homework and children's schooling, many women are leaving the workforce in large numbers all over the world. This is worrying. This is a worrying trend, and we would like both public sector as well as private sector employers to think about what a workforce that does not have sufficient women in it look like going into the future, and to take specific measures which include more family leave, more parental leave, more childcare facilities, more flexible working hours in order to get women back into the labor force. And finally, I want to say a word about financing. 20 years ago, there was no such thing as a green bond. Many, many years ago, the World Bank did the first vaccine bond in the world. Today, green bonds are fairly common, and many countries in the world have issued green bonds. But as of today, not a single country in the world has issued a sovereign gender bond. And so now we are working with interested governments who are interested in social bond issuances to see how we can adapt those frameworks to create incentives for sovereign issuers to issue gender bonds. And I'm very pleased to say that on the 18th of October, UN Women, along with the International Finance Corporation and the International Capital Markets Association, will launch a revised social bond framework that will include gender principles, so that those countries that are interested in going to the market and issuing gender bonds will now be able to do so, and will be able to give assurances to investors that they are truly following gender lens principles in their issuances. This is something that we think there is a huge market for, and it is a new idea. It is an innovation, and we're hoping that there will be uptake for this from a number of governments, and we're already in conversation with several governments. But this is also an opportunity for the private sector, because the private sector can be at the forefront, and business can be at the forefront of pushing gender equality by both having a gender lens in their corporate financing programs, but also ensuring that they are adhering to gender lens principles as they think about recruitment of staff, retention of female staff, promotion of women, as well as ensuring that they are within their own businesses, creating an environment that is free of violence against women, that is free of sexual harassment, and that creates the best enabling environment that there can be for women. With these sorts of measures, we can expect that there will be a significant shift in the focus on SDGs, both in the public and in the private sector. Let me say that as we think about going into COP26, and as the Secretary General has said over and over again at the recently concluded general debate of the General Assembly of the United Nations, which has been taking place here in New York over the last 10 days, that we are really facing an existential crisis. And this is no longer a nice to have. This is something that, if left unaddressed, will mean a very different future, not just for us, but certainly for our children. If we want to emerge out of the COVID pandemic with building a world that is truly different, we need to be thinking about building forward. The words building back better need to be replaced by building forward differently. And in order to do that, the ESG lens is going to be essential for the implementation of the SDGs. There is no second planet. There is no second opportunity. Someone once said, no good crisis should go to waste. This once-in-a-lifetime crisis is also a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build forward differently. Thank you.